Subject which is drowned in stigma. What we're going to be talking about today is suicide. Suicide is an action which is the byproduct of the feeling of total powerlessness. It occurs when someone has focused on negative thoughts for so long or with such intensity that they become cut off from who they really are, from positive vibrations, from their desires. Source energy is therefore prevented from flowing through them by them, and as such they feel as if they are in a chasm so absent of light that there is no way out. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no way out of that dark. Intuitively, we all know that Source is pure positive vibration. So intuitively, we all know that to die is to reemerge with that pure positive vibration. We know that it is relief. And so from that perspective, like I was talking about earlier, that perspective that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, it seems like the only option. To most people, the process of exiting this life into death seems like jumping off of a giant cliff. It seems like a lot of risk. But when you're in that kind of a chasm, where life is so dark to you, that doesn't seem like much of a risk. So instead of jumping off of a cliff, it feels a little bit more like jumping off of a rock. What suicide is pushing the reset button. It's not a good or bad decision in and of itself. It's not something that Source either condones or condemns. You cannot say that suicide is wrong without also saying that death is wrong. Death is always a choice. You choose not to participate in the same way as you chose to participate in the first place. Because you are 2 points of perspective. What I mean by this is, every single death on this earth could be seen as a suicide. Because in order to die, your individual perspective has to align with your higher self-perspective in order to die. Basically, when your source energy is pulling back from you, back into non-physical perspective, you have to align with that decision. This is why a lot of people may end up in comas. What a coma is somebody deciding whether to stay or whether to align with death. So, death is always a choice, regardless of whether you're in an accident and you weren't necessarily intending to die in the first place, or whether you choose to take your death into your own hands and commit suicide. We who are left behind in the wake of grief find it very easy to jump to advise against suicide. We jump to say that it's wrong, which is the same as saying that we know better what is and isn't right for somebody than they know, which just isn't true. Those of us who resist the lower vibrational decisions, like suicide, suffer every bit as much as those who embrace them. But what we need to do instead is really to allow. We need to allow things like suicide, while simultaneously focusing on what we would prefer. Obviously, what we would prefer is for somebody to move through life hand in hand with joy. There are no consequences for those who commit suicide. That idea of there being a consequence is not an idea which Source came up with. It's an idea which humans came up with. And it is an idea which is born from the attempt of humans to control one another. Really, where you see the birth of the idea that there is suffering after death waiting for you as the result of suicide comes from the early Christian Roman era. What was happening at that point basically is that you could call it the higher-ups in the government and also the religions, began to tell people that they needed to start to conform. This is just the human power dynamic. Whenever you tell somebody you need to conform, you're basically saying that what you think is right for them is better than what they think is right for them. And when people start to follow conformity, they begin to suffer. And so then you watch this thing where the churches came up with the idea that life is about suffering and that all of your reward happens after death. And when people started hearing that, after, of course, ironically being taxed, what was happening in these countries at this time is there was a lot of taxation happening. And this taxation was so intense that it was ruining people's families. It was ruining their lives, basically. And when people heard this message over and over again, that your life is suffering, that this is a place of being tested, and that your reward happens after you die, they just started taking matters into their own hands and they started committing suicide. And then suddenly you see these teachings arise conveniently, which looks like suicide is a sin. And to die, basically, is to receive your reward after death for having lived this life of suffering and of trial. However, if you take your own life, then that's a sin and you end up in purgatory, basically. And that was what they did in order to try to get people to stop committing suicide when they were doing so as a result of all of the taxation and control that was happening around them from the religion and from the governments that were being set up at that time. And now it has evolved into this idea that if you are given life by God and that is seen as a gift, then you have to accept that gift of life, and to not accept that gift of life and to take your own life is a bit of a slap in the face to a God which knows better than you do what is good for you and what isn't. So that is where the idea of suffering as a consequence for suicide arose. Suicide is what happens when a person is unable, not incapable, but unable to keep up with their own expansion. In order to explain this, I'm going to refer to a diagram which I like to use. If you will look back at one of my previous videos called What is the Purpose of Life, you'll see this diagram, which I suggest that you do. But for the sake of this explanation of what suicide is, I'm going to show you this diagram now. What's happening with somebody who decides to commit suicide is, here in their physical perspective, in their physical shoes, they are experiencing intense negativity. That negativity is inspiring what they would prefer. So every time they experience misery, they are giving rise to the idea of what it is like to live a life of joy. Every time they feel alone, they are giving birth to the idea of what it would feel like to live where you feel like you're surrounded by supportive company. But they are continuing to think negative thoughts which hold them a match to this vibration instead of this vibration. Even though, the second that they give rise to this idea, their higher self becomes that vibration immediately. And what has begun to happen is this large gravitational pull has started over here and is now pulling them towards it. And they, every time they think these negative thoughts or continue to focus negatively, are faced in the opposite direction of it. And after you see this process go on, this gap in here, which could be seen as like a stream, becomes so incredibly intense that every time they think a thought which is in resistance, it's like going against the Grand Canyon River instead of going against a tiny little brook. And so they start to suffer. That is what suffering is when somebody holds themselves separate from what they are, separate from their desires, to such a degree that this vibrational gap becomes this chasm. And they get to such a point where, like I explained earlier in this video, that this seems so dark, so devoid, and so vibrationally different than what they have become already, and their desires, that it seems like the only way to close this gap is to die, which is what happens. Every time you die, this gap is closed. So that's what's occurring when somebody decides to take their own life. The purpose of this life in the first place is expansion. We are causing the expansion of this universe through our very lives that we are living. Because of this, you could say that Source's greatest desire and your ultimate greatest desire is expansion, which is served by experience. Having said that, it's important to note that it is likely that if somebody decides to commit suicide, that from the higher perspective, which they will rejoin after death, they will most likely opt back into the same kind of issues that caused them to leave in this life. The reason is because if they reactivate those same issues and choose into a life where they experience the same kind of contrast, so to speak, then their expansion would be greatly served by getting to a different space relative to that subject. So if they're capable of coming back into the same problems, but in the next life, coming to a point about those issues where they are able to get through them and find a space of joy, then they will reach a different point of perspective and they will have achieved greater expansion. For those of you who have been left behind by suicide, it is easy to blame yourself, and it is easy to feel guilt as if you could have done something different to save them. But it is the same as saying that I am responsible for somebody else's happiness. And you aren't. You aren't responsible for anyone's happiness, except your own. Not even your spouse's, and not even your child's. So it's important to allow the complex processes of shock and anger and guilt and despair that come along with death in general, but are greatly amplified by suicide. And it's important to let yourself, if it comes up, feel the sensation of relief. We are taught that to feel relief in tandem with suicide is wrong if we love somebody, but relief is often a feeling which is associated for those who are involved with suicide. It's a part of the process because many of you who have lost somebody to suicide know that the burden of being near somebody who has such intense negative focus is a very great burden. So you must allow yourself to grieve in your own way and to not rush yourself. And to realize the healing is never linear. You may have these periods during the grief process where you feel a kind of a setback. But that's just because healing will continue to happen in cycles and in patterns. And so you may re-experience the feeling of grief when you get to anniversaries or when those people aren't present at holidays and things like this. For those of you who are interested, I'm going to be writing an article on how to heal from the loss of somebody who has taken their own life with suicide. More expansion comes from life than comes from death. More expansion comes from joy than ever came from suffering. That is why Source would choose life. That is why Source chose life in the first place, and that's why you did. But there is nothing wrong about suicide. And it's time that we remove it from its stigma, because in my opinion, the stigma that surrounds suicide creates more suffering for those who are left behind. It makes the suffering worse. Focusing in such a way that your life becomes the manifestation of that positive vibrational stance is always in your hands, and it's in everyone's hands. Not everyone may know how to go about doing that, because we live our lives as a sort of default byproduct of how we were raised. We live in default so often that many people who are drowning and suffering have no idea how to change the way that they feel. It's not your responsibility to create their happiness for them. You can inspire somebody by finding your own alignment with joy, to find their own joy. But for those who, for whatever reason, find themselves unable to find that alignment, we don't need to condemn their decision to commit suicide. Really, once they do, we must understand that that is relief and it is release, and they have set themselves free, and they have pushed the reset button, and they have re-emerged with Source perspective. And from there it's all about us, those of us who are left behind, finding our alignment again.